A man shoved a 79-year-old veteran to the ground outside a hardware store in front of a dozen witnesses. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. The man laughed, dusted off his hands, and walked away like he owned the sidewalk, because in Millhaven, Nova Scotia, he basically did. What he didn't know was that the old man's son-in-law had just parked his truck around the corner, and the German shepherd sitting in the passenger seat had been trained to subdue armed combatants in 3 seconds flat. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story stays with you, please subscribe for more. The town of Millhaven sits at the end of a 2-lane road that winds along the Bay of Fundy, tucked between salt marsh and spruce forest, like something that forgot to grow. It has a gas station, a hardware store, a Legion Hall that smells of old carpet and older arguments, and a diner called the Harbor Spoon that has served the same chowder recipe since 1974. In October, the bay turns the color of pewter, and the wind off the water cuts right through whatever you're wearing, no matter how prepared you think you are. Most people who live in Millhaven have lived there their whole lives. They know each other's trucks by sound. They know which families have been there for generations and which ones are just visiting, even if the visit has stretched to 30 years. Gus Morrow had been there for 79 of them. He was a lean, quiet man with hands that had been shaped by decades of work, first in the Navy in his 20s, then in the boatyard on the edge of town, and finally in his own small workshop where he repaired outboard motors for whoever needed it. He walked with a slight lean to the left, a remnant of a fall from a dock in 1987 that had never quite healed right. His wife, Lorraine, had passed 4 years prior. His daughter, Nessa, called every Sunday without fail. His son-in-law was coming up from Halifax to help him winterize the workshop. That was the plan for the week: seal, drain the lines, stack the firewood, be back in Halifax by Friday. It was a simple plan, a good one. It didn't survive Tuesday morning. Gus had walked to the hardware store on River Street to pick up a box of weather-stripping tape and a bag of foam rope. He did this on foot even though his truck was in the yard, because the walk was 20 minutes each way and he believed in earning his coffee. He was on his way back, paper bag tucked under one arm, when a black pickup with a chrome grill bar pulled to the curb and Clement Goss stepped out. Clement Goss was 51 years old, thick-necked, and had the permanent expression of a man who had never been told no, in a language he respected. He ran Goss Marine Development Limited, which had, over the past 3 years, acquired 6 of the 8 waterfront properties in Millhaven through what the town's official record described as private sales. What the private sales actually looked like was a different matter entirely. But in Millhaven, the official record was the only record that mattered. And the official record was kept by people who played cards with Clement's brother on Thursday nights. Clement's target for the past 8 months had been Gus Morrow's boatyard. It sat on the last unacquired stretch of deep water frontage, and without it, Clement's planned marina development, 42 slips, a fuel dock, and a restaurant called the Captain's Table, could not proceed. He had sent offers. He had sent lawyers. He had sent a man from town council named Herb Quinlan to have a friendly conversation over coffee that turned out to be neither friendly nor a conversation. Gus had declined all of them. Quietly, Clement called out across the sidewalk like he was flagging down a cab. Gus stopped. He turned. He looked at Clement the way you look at weather coming in off the water, noting it, calculating it, not alarmed. "You're in my way," Gus said, simply, because Clement was standing between him and the direction he needed to go. Clement smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "That's funny," he said. "I was going to say the same thing about you." He walked toward Gus slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, 2 of his crew stepping out of the truck behind him, not saying anything, just being present. In Millhaven, being present was often enough. "You're going to sell that property, Gus," Clement said. He kept his voice low, conversational, like they were discussing the weather. "I'm giving you the courtesy of telling you to your face this time." "You've given me that courtesy 4 times now," Gus said. "My answer hasn't changed. It's going to." Clement stepped closer. I've been patient. I've made fair offers, but you're blocking something that's going to benefit this entire town, and I'm tired of waiting on one stubborn old man to figure that out. The boatyard is not for sale." Gus turned to go. That was when Clement put his hand on Gus's shoulder. Not a grab, just a placement, a demonstration. "You stay where I put you." Gus removed the hand, calmly, the way you'd move a branch off a path. Something in Clement's face changed. He swung his arm. Not a punch, an open shove, both hands to the chest, fast and hard. Gus was not expecting it. His heel caught the edge of a crack in the sidewalk where the frost had heaved the concrete the previous winter, and he went down, first to his knees, then sideways onto the pavement, his paper bag spilling weather stripping across the ground. 11 people were on River Street at that moment. A woman with a stroller, 2 men outside the Legion. A teenager on a bicycle who stopped pedaling. A woman in the window of the post office who went very still. No one moved. Clement looked down at Gus. He had the expression of a man who had made a point. He adjusted the front of his jacket. "Think about it," he said, and walked back to his truck. The truck pulled away. Gus sat on the cold pavement for a moment, one hand braced on the ground, gathering himself. 60 feet away, a dark green pickup had just turned onto River Street from the east. The driver had seen the whole thing. His name was Reid. Reid Calloway, 38 years old, although most people who met him guessed younger until they looked at his eyes. He had been in the Navy for 14 years, the last 7 of those in a unit whose full name appeared on very few official documents and even fewer news reports. He was on leave. 11 days, which he had planned to spend helping Gus winterize the workshop, eating Nessa's cooking, and possibly going for long runs along the shore in the morning quiet. In the passenger seat sat Kodiak, a 4-year-old German shepherd, black and tan, 73 pounds of trained focus. Kodiak had served 2 tours with Reid before transitioning to civilian life alongside him. He was not aggressive without command. He was not loud. He was, at the moment, watching the black truck pull away from the curb with an attention that was very specific and very calm. Reid parked. He got out. He walked to where Gus was picking himself up off the sidewalk, retrieved the weather stripping from the pavement, folded the paper bag, handed everything back without a word. "I'm fine," Gus said. Reid looked at his father-in-law's hands, scraped, the left one bleeding slightly at the heel of the palm. "Who was that?" Reid said. It wasn't a question. "Clement Goss." Gus brushed off his coat. "Local developer. He wants the boatyard." Reid said nothing for a moment. He watched the direction the black truck had gone. "He's done this before," Gus said. "The others sold." "I'm not going to." "No," Reid said. "You're not." He looked at the windows of the surrounding buildings. The woman in the post office had stepped back from the glass. The men outside the Legion were suddenly very interested in something across the street. Reid had seen this pattern before. Not here, not in Nova Scotia, not in a town that smelled of salt and spruce. But the pattern was the same regardless of geography. He knew what it looked like when a community had learned to look away. He helped Gus into the truck. He drove them back to the workshop without discussing what he was thinking, which was something else that looked the same regardless of geography. That evening, after Gus had cleaned up his hands and eaten dinner and gone to bed early the way he always did, Reid sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a cup of tea and began to read. 3 hours later, he closed the laptop. He sat for a while in the dark. Kodiak lay across his feet, which was something the dog did when it sensed Reid was in calculation mode. It helped. It always had. "All right," Reid said quietly. To no one, he had found enough to know that what had happened on River Street was not a single incident. It was a system. And systems left evidence. There are places in every small town where the real decisions get made, and it is almost never where the sign on the building says. In Millhaven, the decisions that mattered were made in the back office of Goss Marine Development Limited, above a bait shop on Harbor Road, in a room that smelled of fresh paint and old money. The walls were bare, the desk was large. The view out the window was the very stretch of water that Clement had been methodically buying the shore. Beneath, on Wednesday morning, that room held 3 people. Clement Goss sat at his desk, Across from him was Herb Quinlan, the town councilor, a man in his 60s who had learned, over the course of a long career in local politics, how to make himself very useful without ever appearing responsible for anything. And leaning against the wall with his arms crossed was Dale Foyer, who held the title of chief of police but functioned, in practice, more like a very expensive piece of furniture that occasionally reminded people of the consequences of inconvenience. "The son-in-law," Clement said. "He said it the way you'd say the leak or the problem, like a plumbing issue that needed addressing." "He's Navy? Retired?" Herb asked. "Active duty. Leave." Clement turned a pen over in his hand. "He's been asking around. Talked to 3 of the people who sold to us in the last 2 years. Herb shifted in his chair. "That's fine. They signed everything legally. They signed because they wanted to," Dale said from the wall. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had never had to raise it. Clement set down the pen. "I want him to understand that his vacation is over. That there's nothing here for him to find and nothing here worth staying for." Herb nodded. That was the kind of sentence he was good at hearing without quite processing. Dale pushed off the wall. "I'll have someone stop by the property. Routine check. Code compliance." "Good." Clement looked out the window at the bay. "The old man will come around. He always does eventually. They all do." He believed this completely. He always had. And for 3 years he had been correct. The code compliance officer came by the workshop Thursday morning, a young constable named Terrell, who looked uncomfortable and kept touching the radio on his belt like it might save him from the situation. Reid answered the door with Kodiak at his side, sitting calmly. Reid said nothing. He just looked at Terrell with the particular patience of a man who was not surprised. Terrell explained that there had been an anonymous complaint, structural irregularities in the east wall. It would require an inspection. Gus would need to produce permits for any renovations made in the last 5 years. Reid listened to all of this then. He said, "When was the complaint filed?" Terrell checked his notes. "Yesterday afternoon." "What time did my father-in-law's altercation with Clement Goss occur?" Terrell went still. "Tuesday morning," Reid said helpfully. "Right around 10:15. 11 witnesses." He paused. "Has the anonymous complaint been logged with the Provincial Inspection Registry, or just with the local office?" Terrell touched his radio again. "I'd like a copy of the complaint filed under Provincial Disclosure Rules," Reid said. "Section 22 of the Municipal Government Act. You can email it. I'll give you the address." Terrell wrote it down. He left without conducting an inspection. Reid watched the car go from the window. Kodiak sat beside him. What Terrell didn't know, what almost no one in Millhaven knew, was that Reid had spent the previous night on the phone, not long calls, efficient ones, to a lawyer in Halifax who specialized in municipal governance, to a contact at the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit who owed him a professional courtesy from 3 years ago, and a different province, and, quietly, to a journalist at the Chronicle Herald who covered rural development and had been investigating irregularities in Nova Scotia coastal land acquisition for 6 months. The journalist's name was Verity Shanahan. She had been waiting for a case that had documentation. Nessa arrived. She drove up from Halifax in her old Subaru with a bag of groceries in the back and a specific expression on her face that Reid had come to recognize over 7 years of marriage, the one that said she was already 3 steps ahead of the situation and was only arriving now because she'd been giving everyone time to catch up. She was 41. She had her father's way of moving through a room, quiet and purposeful, and her mother's habit of making a cup of tea before she said anything that mattered. She made a cup of tea. Then she sat at the kitchen table and looked at Reid. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. Nessa was not a woman who interrupted. She listened the way she cooked, completely, without distraction, tasting everything before she commented. When Reid finished, she held her mug and looked at the middle distance. "The 3 families who sold," she said. "Did any of them get fair market value?" "The Pelletiers got 60 cents on the dollar," Reid said. "The Andersons got less." The Clement property was assessed at $400,000 2 months before they sold it for $210,000. The assessment was done by a firm that Herb Quinlan's brother-in-law owns a third of. Nessa set down her mug. "There's your fraud. There's one of them." She looked at him. "And my father didn't tell me any of this." "Your father," Reid said carefully, "has been managing it on his own for 8 months because he didn't want you to worry." Nessa was quiet for a moment. In the workshop across the yard, they could hear Gus moving around, the familiar soft clang of tools being organized. Put away arranged his way of thinking. "He's not going to like what happens next," Nessa said. "No," Reid agreed. "But he's not going to stop us either." She almost smiled. "No," she said, "he's not. There is a particular kind of power that men like Clement Goss mistake for invincibility. It comes from years of operating in a place too small for oversight, too isolated for scrutiny, too polite to push back. They begin to believe that the silence is agreement, that the looking away is acceptance. They forget, or perhaps they never knew, that silence has a limit, and that what lives beyond arrived in Millhaven on Friday with a laptop bag, a digital recorder, and a voice that cut through fog. She was 53. Small, sharp-eyed, and had the energy of someone who had spent 30 years being underestimated in professional settings and had learned to convert that into velocity. She met Reid and Nessa at the Harbor Spoon at 7 in the morning, over coffee and the chowder. Reid gave her the file he had assembled, the assessment discrepancy on the Clement property, the timeline of the code complaint versus the assault, the corporate ownership structure of Goss Marine Development that linked 3 shell companies back to a numbered corporation in New Brunswick, and the bank records, legally obtained through his lawyer, showing payments from that corporation to a private account held by Herb Quinlan. Verity read everything in order. She didn't speak until she finished. Then she looked up. "This is the Quinlan account?" 14 separate transfers, Reid said. "Over 18 months. The last one was 9 days ago." Verity sat back. "Do you know why he's been paying Quinlan specifically?" "Quinlan sits on the land use committee," Nessa said. "He's voted in favor of every rezoning application Clement has submitted. 6 of them in 3 years. Every single one? Every single one." Verity looked at her recorder on the table, then at Reid. "I need to talk to the 3 families who sold. They've agreed to speak. Separately. Off the record first, on the record if they're willing after." Reid slid a piece of paper across the table, a Decision Times. She picked it up, held it. "You've been doing this for 4 days." "I've been doing this for longer than that," Reid said, which was the truest thing he'd said all week. The Pelletier family lived on the edge of town, in a house that had been in the family since the 1950s. Gerard Pelletier was 74, a widower, with the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from age but from having done something you regret. He had sold his waterfront property 18 months ago. He told Verity, in a voice that barely rose above the sound of the wood stove, that the decision had been preceded by 3 months of what he described as inconvenience. His driveway had been repeatedly blocked by Clement's trucks. His garbage bins had been cited for code violations twice in a single month. 2 of the 3 neighbors who shared his road told him they'd been asked by Dale to speak to him about being reasonable. He had been 72, alone, and tired. "I didn't know there was another way," he said. "I thought that was just how things went." Verity recorded everything. At the end, she asked him if he'd be willing to say it on the record with his name. Gerard was quiet for a long time. "Is it going to make a difference?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He wanted to know if it was worth it. "Yes," Verity said. "I believe it is." He nodded once. "All right then." That same afternoon, Reid was doing what he almost always did when he was thinking, moving. He ran the shore road with Kodiak at his side, the dog matching him stride for stride, ears forward, the kind of easy synchrony that comes from years of working together. The bay was steel gray, the tide running hard. He heard a car slow behind him. He kept running. The car matched his pace. He stopped, turned. Dale Foyer's police vehicle sat on the shoulder. Dale climbed out, He didn't hurry. He walked toward Reid with the specific slowness of a man who believed that time was a resource he controlled. "Enjoying your visit," Dale said. "I am," Reid said. Kodiak sat. His eyes were on Dale, very calm. "People around here," Dale said. "They like things quiet. It's why they live here. It's why they stay." He looked at the bay. "Stirring things up doesn't do anyone any favors." Reid said nothing. He waited. "Whatever it is you're looking into," Dale continued, "I'd encourage you to consider whether it's really your business." Reid considered this briefly. "My father-in-law was assaulted on a public sidewalk in front of 11 people, he said. "No report was filed. That's my business." Dale's expression didn't change. "These things sometimes resolve themselves." "Some things do," Reid agreed. "Some things require outside assistance." He held Dale's gaze without expression. "I've asked the RCMP's Commercial Crime Unit to assign a file coordinator. I expect confirmation by Monday. I've also arranged for a formal complaint about the assault to be submitted through the Provincial Serious Incident Response Team, which, as I'm sure you know, operates independently of municipal policing." Dale said nothing. "I'm telling you this directly," Reid said, "because I want to be transparent. You'll hear it anyway. Better to hear it from me." He reached down and touched Kodiak's head once lightly. "Good afternoon." He turned and finished his run. On Saturday morning, Clement Goss received 3 calls before 9 o'clock. The first was from Herb Quinlan, whose voice had a quality Clement had never heard in it before: unsteadiness. The second was from his lawyer, who used phrases like significant exposure and beneficial to get ahead of this. The third was from his wife. Her name was Patricia. She had married Clement 23 years ago, when he was still someone who talked about what he was going to build, rather than who he was going to push aside to build it. Over 2 decades, she had watched the transformation with a specific kind of grief, the grief of watching someone choose, again and again, the version of themselves you'd hoped they'd outgrow. She had stayed because of the children, and then because leaving felt like an admission she wasn't ready to make, and then because of pure exhausted inertia. She did not call to support him. She called because she had been at the Harbor Spoon on Thursday morning and had seen Verity Shanahan reading documents at a table with a young couple she didn't recognize. She had recognized the corporate letterhead on one of the pages because she had signed enough checks over the years to know what Goss Marine Development Limited looked like on paper. And she had thought about it for 2 days. 2 days of sitting with something that felt, finally, like a decision she could make. "I want you to listen to me," she said on the phone. Clement started to say something about the situation being manageable. "No," Patricia said. "Listen." He stopped. "I know about the Quinlan payments. I know about the assessments. I know about what happened to Gerard Pelletier and the others." She kept her voice very level. "I have been quiet about this for a long time. I am not going to be quiet anymore." Clement's voice changed. It got quieter. That particular quiet that is not peace but its opposite. "Patricia, I've spoken with a lawyer," she said. "My lawyer, not yours. I have documents. And I'm going to speak with the journalist who is already working on this story, and I'm going to tell her everything I know." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in her kitchen, hands flat on the table, breathing. The house was very quiet. Outside, the maple in the yard had dropped half its leaves overnight, and the rest trembled in the wind off the bay. She picked up her phone and called Verity Shanahan. There is no dramatic way to describe what happens when a system of corruption loses its load-bearing wall. It doesn't collapse all at once. It settles unevenly, each piece bearing more than it was designed to hold, until the weight redistribution reaches the piece that cannot compensate, and then things move quickly. Herb Quinlan contacted the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit on Sunday afternoon. He arrived without a lawyer. He brought a folder. He answered every question for 4 hours and 40 minutes. The coordination moved fast after that. The financial trail that Reid had assembled, combined with Patricia's documentation, which included internal emails, a second set of corporate books, and 3 years of bank records, gave the investigators what they needed to move on multiple fronts simultaneously. Dale Foyer was placed on administrative suspension by the provincial police oversight body on Monday morning. The announcement was made at a press conference attended by more media than Millhaven had seen in its recorded history. Dale arrived at the station for what he believed was a routine morning, found 3 RCMP officers in plainclothes, and had the specific experience of finally understanding that the protections he had relied on were no longer operational. Clement Goss was served with a court order freezing his corporate assets at 11:15 the same morning. He did not resist. He sat in his office above the bait shop on Harbor Road, looking out at the bay, and said nothing for a long time. The Chronicle Herald published Verity's story at noon, a 14,000-word account of 3 years of systematic property fraud, intimidation, and corruption in a Nova Scotia coastal town. It was precise. It named names. It included Gerard Pelletier's account, on the record, in his own words. Within 48 hours it had been ever heard of Millhaven, Nova Scotia. Gus Morrow sat on the old wooden bench outside his workshop on Monday afternoon and read the article on his phone, very slowly, with his reading glasses on. Kodiak lay in the thin autumn sun nearby, dozing, comfortable with the quiet. When Gus finished, he set the phone down on his knee. He looked out at the bay. He sat there for a while. Reid came out of the workshop and sat on the bench beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. That was fine. They had always been comfortable with quiet. "You didn't tell me you were doing all that," Gus said finally. "You would have told me to leave it alone," Reid said. Gus considered this. "Probably," he said. "You would have been wrong." "Probably," Gus said again. He almost smiled. "The Pelletiers, the Andersons, the Comeaus," he was quiet again. "They sign anything yet? About the properties? The lawyers are working on recovery proceedings. It'll take time. But the assessments were fraudulent, which means the sales can potentially be challenged, especially now that Quinlan's cooperation is on record." Gus nodded slowly. He looked at his hands, the scraped one, healing now, the skin knitting back together the way it always had. Lorraine would have had something to say about all this. What would she have said? Gus thought for a moment. That it took too long, that somebody should have said something years ago. He paused, and then she'd have made soup. He stood up. He was steady. He went back into the workshop. That evening, Nessa and Reid sat on the porch with coffee while Kodiak investigated the perimeter of the yard with his usual thoroughness. The bay was calm, the color of old silver in the last of the light. Somewhere across the water a loon called once and didn't repeat itself. "Patricia Goss asked if she could speak with you," Nessa said. "I know," Reid said. "Verity told me. She's not staying in the house. She's at a friend's place in Wolfville." Nessa held her mug. "She was afraid for a long time. Most people who see something wrong and stay silent are afraid," Reid said. "It doesn't make them bad people." "No," Nessa said. "Just human." She looked at him. "Are you going to talk to her?" "Yes," he said. "Good." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment. Then she straightened and watched the bay. Kodiak came back from his perimeter check and sat at Reid's feet with the settled confidence of a dog who has inspected the situation and found it acceptable. A week earlier, this had been a town that had learned to look away, where silence had been the rule for so long that people had begun to mistake it for peace, where a man could shove a 79-year-old veteran to the ground on a public sidewalk and walk away without consequence. Because consequence was a thing that happened to people without connections. It didn't feel like that anymore. There would be proceedings. There would be hearings. There would be paperwork. As there always is after something breaks apart that should have been tended to long before it broke. None of that was quick or clean or dramatic, but the silence had been broken. And in the narrator's experience of these things, that is always where it begins. The boatyard would stay.